In keeping with custom, I'd like to thank Kevin Madalena for making our blessing this morning by giving him a gift. It's a copy of a book I wrote many years ago about the history of European natural history in the time of Galileo, at a time when the Earth stood still much closer to the cosmic meaning of things than it seems to do now, at least in white cultures. At the center of the book stands not just Galileo's discovery of the heliocentric universe, but a small book, a herbal, made by a Nahuatl Amerindian, in which he illustrated all the medicinal plants of the Aztec. And this book was then given to the King of Spain, perhaps under subtle duress. A handmade facsimile was made of this already in 1616, a copy by the foresightful people around Galileo for the deep and ancient natural wisdom it contained. In 1976, the original book, written and illustrated, as I say, by a Nahuatl Amerindian, which then lay in the Vatican Library in Rome, was given back by the Pope to the Archaeological Museum in Mexico City. Now, if the Pope, even a reactionary Pope, can give back and restore such a treasure, could not our leaders in Washington begin to reflect about the many restitutions that still lie before us in this country? So Kevin, here I give you a copy of the Eye of the Lynx with my thanks and that of all of us.
Thank you.
And Kevin is a paleontologist, amongst other things, and you will find many fossil remains in the book as they debated when these things came to Earth. So, I'm David Freedberg, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Italian Academy this morning. We are honored by your presence, and especially those of you who have traveled so far to be with us today, to debate and protest the consequences of another assault on the indigenous lands of what has come to be called the United States of America. To begin with, as I just mentioned, we are conscious of the fact that we stand here on Lenape land this morning, and of the need for a university named after the Italian explorer who began the cruel displacement of the original owners of its entire inhabited territory, to acknowledge its role in the preemptions that continue and form the subject of our meeting today. When I first read of Trump's decision to reduce Bears Ears, following on the toleration of the exploitation of the lands immediately adjacent to the sacred site that is Chaco, I decided that the International Observatory for Cultural Heritage, which we founded here at the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America, should not only be concerned with the fate of monuments, sacred sites, and antiquities abroad in places like Syria, Iraq, and Italy, but also with the ongoing attacks on the great cultural, artistic, and architectural heritage of the native peoples of the continent now called America. Everyone around us, everywhere around us, from the southwest to the northeast, from Arizona, California, and Texas in the south to Montana, the Dakotas, and Michigan in the north, the material remains of both ancient and more recent American history have been overlooked, ignored, and erased. There is so much to be done, so much still to be studied, recorded, even dated. For every time I go to Canyon de Chelly or Mesa Verde or the Hopi Mesas, when I visit the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot villages of Maine, I realize how much sheer historical work remains to be done before the sands cover the sacred remains and the seas wash away the carvings on the shoreline. And now man himself, to use the old gendered term, which seems curiously appropriate, comes again. The white man, failing to acknowledge the owners of the lands and the beauty, both natural and human, it contains. But let me stop myself here. We've got much to do on a busy day. I can't tell you how grateful I am to all of you who have come from all corners of America to record your sense of the urgency of the issues at stake, to present the facts, to document what risks being lost, what is being lost, and to make the case for greater love, tenderness, and respect. Thank you all for making the effort to be here. To my colleagues at Columbia who are not here, I say and will continue to say that this was the moment for solidarity, for building relationships that can at least begin to repair the losses and the threats. I want to thank all of you who have come to be here today, but especially Angelo Bacca, whose input and support from the outset has been extraordinary. 3 days after I decided that the International Observatory for Cultural Heritage should sponsor this event, I read his eloquent and very beautiful op-ed in the New York Times about Bears Ears, and it totally inspired me. I called him, explained the project. Where are you, Angelo? Right here, good. Right in front as it should be. I called him, explained the project, and from that day on, he has been stalwart in his help on every possible occasion. I want to thank Nadima Agard, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, for her precious advice. Alison Jeffrey, my dear colleague, where are you, Alison? Somewhere at the back, standing at the back as always, my dear colleague, who has worked, as all of you who have corresponded with her know, tirelessly yet always courteously on putting together this event. To my other colleagues, Barbara Faeda and Abigail Asher, for their deep commitment to making today work, as well as to all my other colleagues on the staff of the Academy, Rick Whitaker, Baron Preston, Adele Parsons, Karen de Graffenried, our indispensable work studies, and our fellow this year, Dusan Boric, who knows about peoples extending even further back to the dawn of humankind in the Paleolithic age and earlier. I'm grateful to my Columbia colleagues, especially Trevor Reed, Elsa Stamatopoulos, and from my own Department of Art History and Archaeology, Elizabeth Hutchinson, for joining us in our united sense of urgency about the issues at stake and the need to raise them now. And then, of course, there are the rest of you. I'm just going to read the names because you will hear it again, them again. Amalia Cordova, Honor Keeler, Theresa Pasqual, Sandy Grandi, Rollie Wilson, Angelo, we've mentioned, Catherine Belzovsky, Kevin Madalena, who of course gave our blessing, Trevor Reed, whom I've mentioned, Carrie Heitman, and Robert Lucero. To all of you, I just want to thank you for being here today. And now on to business. Let's never forget the importance of the task before us, of the need to combat as forcefully, maybe fiercely, as we can, the ignorance and baseness that underlies the threats to Bears Ears, Chaco, and all other sacred sites at risk, all those aspects of native heritage and the world's heritage from which we should learn, not scant, by which we should be inspired, not give over to those who have no right to be there, who come to possess the lands of others to make money or to advance self-interest. This is not the way that all of you have chosen. This is not an example to follow. It is up to us now to show why. So thank you very much for all being here today. And welcome again. So why don't I ask our first speaker? I'm very grateful that she is here. Look at this. I think I've been sufficiently short that we're actually starting on time, in advance of time. That means each of you have 2 minutes more, no more, than your allotted time, and then the gong will go. So I'm very happy that Elsa Stamatopoulou, who is the director of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Program here at Columbia, at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights, and the center. She's also part of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race in the Anthropology Department. But Elsa has a long history of jurisprudence and working at the UN in favor of indigenous rights all over the world. I think you have a copy of her CV, so without further ado, I just want to thank Elsa for being here and for agreeing to start off our discussions today. Elsa.
Thank you very much, David, and good morning to everybody. First of all, I would also like to recognize the indigenous owners of this land where we are meeting today and where our university stands, the land of the Lenape people. And I would like also to warmly congratulate the International Observatory for Cultural Heritage at the Italian Academy for holding this symposium. We are here today because the threats to Bears Ears and Chaco, as well as other places, are clear. And I am proud that our university makes itself relevant to the most pertinent issues of our times through this symposium. What is the context of our world that makes this emergency more apparent today? The more than 390 million indigenous people in about 90 countries today have lands that are some 22% of the Earth's surface, yet account for 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. Out of about 7,000 languages in the world, about 5,000 are estimated to be indigenous peoples' languages. Experts tell us that about 90% are threatened with extinction in the next 100 years. Settler colonialism and domination that has plagued the indigenous peoples is not just a European invention, nor is it historic, meaning past and gone. Settler colonialism continues unabated in this country with new acts, imposed invisibility on indigenous peoples, and refusal to respect, protect, and fulfill their human rights. Land grabbing of indigenous lands is happening as we speak, for example, through state-sponsored settlement of indigenous lands in the Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh, or through so-called conservation projects, soon becoming money-making tools of extractive and other industries that massively displace indigenous peoples in Kenya and elsewhere, or through dams and other mega projects, as is the case in Nepal, India, Brazil, and elsewhere. According to a 2017 report of Frontline Defenders, 67% of the total number of 312 activists killed in 27 countries the previous year were defending land, environmental, and indigenous peoples' rights, nearly always in the context of mega projects. The world-renowned indigenous leader Berta Cáceres in Honduras being one of those to lose her life. Today, the dominant neoliberal development paradigm of a weakened state and erosion of democratic processes and freedoms focuses on extraction, a model of constantly rising consumption and growth that is over-harvesting the Earth's resources. As Oren Lyons, the Onondaga faith keeper, has often said, this is leading humanity to our own doom, seen from environmental degradation and climate change. This unsustainable model, led by barely controlled corporations and investment capital, is now placing perhaps the most imminent threat to the well-being of indigenous peoples around the globe. It targets the Earth's remaining natural resources that are found in ancestral indigenous peoples' lands. But what is the significance and urgency of dealing with cultural heritage as a human right? First, it links cultural heritage to the robust indigenous peoples movement. Second, a human rights approach gives us a well-established international normative framework of cultural rights and also gives us tools of analysis, accountability, awareness, and solutions at national and international level. The mobilization around Bears Ears and Chaco is about people's human rights here and now. It's about their dignity. Walter Echohawk, a pony lawyer at the Native American Rights Fund and professor at the University of Tulsa College of Law, in his book called In the Light of Justice, the Rise of Human Rights in Native America and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, sees a new era emerging after the adoption of the Declaration. Echohawk, who was instrumental in securing passage of 2 federal laws that respect Indian religious freedom and the repatriation of Native American remains, believes that through the Declaration, through the human rights lens, we can see values that are much higher than the state. Would we not be indignant if our cemeteries, churches, temples, and mosques were destroyed by corporations with the encouragement of the state? Didn't we have a huge mobilization in Standing Rock with international participation? Didn't the Parkland shooting bring people out into the streets in the US and around the world in extraordinary numbers this past weekend? Didn't the Idle No More movement of First Nations in Canada create a tremendous push for resistance and change? The Bears' Ears and Chaco struggles are linked to Standing Rock, are linked to Wounded Knee, and to many previous struggles since the time of colonization that have inspired the indigenous movement in this country and around the world. First, let me catch the thread of history. In 1923, Cayuga Chief Tezcahe traveled to Geneva as the representative of the Six Nations of the Iroquois to the League of Nations, the precursor of the UN, to plead the cause of his people. He waited 1 year working for recognition by the League, was not received, and came back in the US. A few months before his death in 25, Chief Tezcahe made a speech by radio in Rochester, New York. The following is an excerpt, quote, "This is the story of the Mohawks, the story of the Oneidas, of the Cayugas, of the Onondagas, the Senecas, and the Tuscaroras. They are the Iroquois. Tell it to those who have not been listening. Maybe I will be stopped from telling it, but if I am prevented from telling it over, as I hope I do, the story will not be lost. I have already told it to thousands of listeners in Europe. It has gone into the records where your children can find it when I may be dead or be in jail for daring to tell the truth. I have told this story in Switzerland. They have free speech in Little Switzerland. One can tell the truth over there in public, even if it is uncomfortable for some great people. I am the speaker of the Six Nations, the oldest League of Nations now existing. It is a league which is still alive and intends, as best it can, to defend the rights of the Iroquois to live under their own laws in their own little countries now left to them, to worship their Great Spirit in their own way, and to enjoy the rights which are surely theirs, as the white man's rights are his own." Unquote. A similar journey was made by Maori chief Ratana in 1925. Ratana decided to protest the breaking of the Treaty of Waitangi concluded with the Maori in New Zealand in 1840 that gave Maori ownership of their lands. Ratana was also not received by the League of Nations. I'm giving you this introduction to show that the history of indigenous peoples making their way to the institutions of the international community of nations is old. Indigenous peoples' sense of themselves as sovereign nations, in parity with the other nations of the world, has always been very strong. And the fact that states concluded treaties with many indigenous peoples is a testimony that indigenous peoples were viewed as sovereign not only by themselves, but also by those who actually invented modern international law, namely states. And what was perhaps a lonely travel in the 20s by these two indigenous leaders has now become one of the most robust, perhaps the most successful international social movement of our times, based on human rights. In the post-Second World War era, states established in Article 1 of the Charter, of the UN Charter, human rights, peace, and development as the main three goals of the organization. And indigenous peoples mobilized nationally, regionally, and internationally, especially since the 70s. They were inspired or strengthened by different waves of the times: decolonization, social justice, civil rights, struggles against racism and discrimination. And Native Americans played a major role in the formation and rise of the global indigenous movement, with Wounded Knee as a symbol. Let me now show you some historic pictures from the very first gathering of the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere in the United Nations in Geneva in 1977. This is the late Audrey Shenandoah, who is holding the Haudenosaunee passport as a sign of the sovereignty of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And this passport is still honored in Switzerland and actually in 22 countries around the world. So I show you these photographs so that you see that people coming in many young people, but also bringing the elders in and holding them, bringing the staffs and coming into the UN to speak their mind. So I want to leave us with this, actually. Yes, let's keep it in that. So it is in that room and at that time that Indigenous peoples adopted the basic elements of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, articulating their visions in human rights terms, and also interpreting human rights to include 3 pillars: the right to self-determination, the right to lands, territories, and resources, and cultural rights. It took from 1982 to 2007 for the UN to adopt the declaration. 25 years of negotiations between states and indigenous peoples, a unique example of participation of stakeholders in the formulation of an international human rights instrument concerning them. Political and legal developments regarding indigenous peoples have galloped in the last 2 decades. While there is no time now to speak of those in any detail, suffices to say here that indigenous peoples movement has achieved the creation of a major and unique international human rights instrument, the Declaration, extraordinary procedures of participation of indigenous peoples in the UN, the creation of 3 indigenous-related UN mechanisms, including the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, where indigenous peoples sit at a level of parity with states, and huge political but also moral visibility as the indigenous peoples cause continues to keep the moral high ground and indigenous peoples continue to advocate not only for respect of their own rights, but also for alternative paradigms of well-being, development, and coexistence, el vivir bien, or suma causai in Spanish and Quechua, that calls for harmony with nature, harmony with community, and with self. While in the early 80s, about 20 people from NGOs attended the first UN meeting on the topic, it was called the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, now more than 1,000 indigenous leaders attend the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that meets in New York every spring. The human rights framework has played a tremendous role in the internationalization of indigenous peoples' issues. And these UN-related processes have prompted the creation of an international indigenous identity and the transformation of local indigenous movements into a global one. Let me turn to the second point. What does a human rights approach to cultural heritage mean? Thanks to the advocacy of indigenous peoples, 17 of the 46 articles of the Declaration are linked to the cultural rights of indigenous peoples, making the Declaration the boldest recognition of cultural rights in international law. The Declaration's adoption has historical, moral, political, and legal significance. It resets the relationship between indigenous peoples and states, paving the path to decolonization of indigenous peoples. In Bolivia, they have a Ministry of Decolonization. What are the main norms that the Declaration sets in terms of cultural heritage? Article 31, indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, design, sports, and traditional games and visual and performing arts. Article 25, indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used, very important, owned or otherwise occupied and used, very relevant to Chaco and Bear's Ears, lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. Article 26, indigenous peoples have the right to lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. So cultural heritage in a human rights framework places it as part of a significant international human rights system. The human rights area is the most codified area of international law, with about 100 instruments that have been adopted since 1945. A number of human rights treaty bodies and human rights special rapporteurs exist that systematically monitor the implementation of human rights treaties, also very relevant to cultural heritage. They include the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Vicky Tauli-Corpus, who visited Standing Rock, in fact, in February 2017 and reported to the General Assembly, and the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Heritage, Karima Benoun, law professor at UC Davis. The human rights approach elevates cultural heritage protection to an international human rights obligation of states. It also underlines protection of cultural heritage rights as part of historic remedies owed to indigenous peoples for the injustices to which they have been subjected. Hence, cultural heritage is surrounded, so to speak, by a panoply of rights that help enrich and deepen its normative content and that require a different approach focusing on human dignity. And this approach evokes the responsibility of the state, which is obliged to take measures to respect, protect, and fulfill cultural heritage-related rights. In other words, these cannot be left to the forces of the market and to commercial exploitation. On the conceptual level, based on the rich analysis done by indigenous peoples and the UN, cultural heritage as a human right means four major things. One, rejecting the colonial doctrine of discovery that saw indigenous peoples' lands as empty lands, or terra nullius. Second, the human rights approach to cultural heritage obliges one to connect cultural heritage with its source of production, to peoples. Cultural heritage is linked to human dignity and identity. Accessing and enjoying cultural heritage is an important feature of being a member of a community, a citizen, and more widely, a member of society. Thirdly, the concept of cultural heritage, tangible and intangible, reflects the dynamic character of something that has been developed, built, or created, interpreted, and reinterpreted in history, and transmitted from generation to generation. Cultural heritage links the past, the present, and the future, as it encompasses things inherited from the past that are considered to be of such value or significance today that individuals and communities want to transmit them to future generations. Significantly, the human rights approach stresses the importance of communities, including indigenous peoples, in defending and stewarding cultural heritage. Also in defining what constitutes destruction of cultural heritage. Fourth point, cultural heritage provides the human rights link between destruction of cultural heritage and state accountability, but also individual, international, criminal accountability. The prohibition of access to a community's cultural heritage site or objects is also seen as destruction of cultural heritage. We have all welcomed the decision of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to charge the destruction of cultural and religious sites as a standalone crime for the first time in the case of Al-Mahdi in Mali. The International Criminal Court found Al-Mahdi, a militia commander, guilty in 2016 of ordering the destruction of mausoleums that were of cultural significance for the indigenous community in Mali. In ending this introduction, let me say this. We have seen an impressive mobilization around Bears Ears and Chaco, with some success until now. But more needs to be done to raise awareness of state actors and of society on the significance of these monuments for the respect of the dignity and of the human rights of Native American nations and their cultures. Indigenous nations concerned and others can strategize about the possible internationalization of the threats to Native American cultural heritage by appealing to the available international human rights mechanisms, including the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, as well as the Human Rights Council itself, and also the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that is meeting in New York next month with a special theme, Indigenous Peoples' Collective Rights to Lands, Territories, and Resources. Tara Benali of the Navajo Nation said, quote, "Losing Bear's ears to a cloud of industrial smoke from extraction and mining does not keep the preservation of life for us," unquote. And cultural heritage is about life. Thank you.
Now we want to move on to Amalia Cordova, Amalia will speak about the creative possibilities. We've heard now about the legal possibilities, so we're covering the spectrum right from the outset, the spectrum of tactics. So I'm very happy to welcome Amalia here, who comes to us from the Smithsonian Institution. Amalia, where are you? She is in... Oh, good. She's ready to go. She's digital curator for new and emerging media there at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. And she also co-curates the Smithsonian Recovering Voices Mother Tongue Film Festival. And she curated the 2017 Smithsonian Folklife program On the Move, Migration Across Generations. So our next project here might well be migration, so you may see Amalia back here again. But please begin now. Amalia, thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
Mare pu lamian pu kumpuchen inche Amalia. Greeting in the Mapuzungun language from Wamapu, Mapuche territory, where I am from. And I want to also acknowledge that we are gathered on Lenape territory, and I want to thank folks who have come from all over and also locally from New York City. The American Indian Community House is present too, and I'm very glad. So I'm going to begin talking about how, following up on Elsa, how this internationalization of this discourse kind of operates and creates awareness through media, particularly. So in the case of Latin America, we have branded a concept to talk about this land, which is known as America, broadly. Sometimes it's just referred to as this country, sometimes it's the whole continent, right? But in terms of the term, we call it Abya Yala. So in one of the forms of organization has been regional organization, and across Latin America this has happened very early on, since the 70s. And there have been international gatherings on the rights of indigenous peoples through a continental summit of indigenous peoples in Latin America. And that's where the term Abya Yala starts to be used, even though it's been theorized before it actually becomes enacted. So what is Abya Yala? It is a Kuna term that the Kuna are in Panama, right, the Isthmus, and Kuna Yala is the Kuna territory, and Abya Yala is everything that surrounds it. But it also has a beautiful meaning. It means mature or ripe land, land in bloom, land full of life, land in its fullest potential. So I think one of the ways that we perform that decolonization through this transnational indigenous movement across Abya Yala is in also changing the names and changing the narrative and using our terminology and using the language. And when we think and conceive of Abya Yala, it is not just a place, it also refers to a mode of exchange, a cooperation, a convergence of experiences and proposals. It refers to the territory, but it refers to Mother Earth, water, and all natural patrimony, to vivir bien, to live well, the summa causa that Elsa was referencing. So here's where we see these alternate paradigms that Elsa was referencing be performed, be adopted, not just thought about, but used on a daily basis. So indigenous communication practices surface at the same time as the indigenous movement. There couldn't be an interlacing of all these places without communication. So traditionally what we call small media, like pamphlets and brochures, before email and all of that, were circulating. There were important manifestos that were written up. Important gatherings like these continental summits that are of indigenous political organizations gatherings, draft declarations after each gathering, and some of the discourse comes from these declarations. So what we see in Latin America or in Abya Yala in the 80s, in 1985, is the first gathering of indigenous communication and film. And this happens in Mexico City in this organization called the Latin American Coordinator of Indigenous Peoples Film and Communication, CLACP. And it grows as a somewhat independent process to the political process. There are relationships, clearly, but as with any other cultural expression, there is artistry, there is mastery, there is the exploration of language. So for a long time, what we saw were dispersed processes across Abya Yala, trying to resist dictatorships on top of the settler state kind of dominant narrative. So the small media evolves into an important media of transmission that is video and radio. So radio is kind of the predecessor to video work. But the collective nature of filmmaking comes very naturally to indigenous communities that already are used to working together. But as a result, the media that emerges is not kind of industry prone. It's not easily absorbed by national cinemas. It doesn't scan as cinema, basically. So part of my work has been to actually look at this from a cinematic point of view, and also bring sort of the indigenous lens into the film world. So what we see happen around 2010 is the convergence of this more disparate indigenous video movement, and I would argue that it is a movement. It isn't kind of a stylistic trend or a genre. Indigenous video is a position. It's a postura, right? That Erica Wortham has written about that. And we see that meet the gathering of the Continental Summit of the Indigenous Nations of Abya Yala. And again, linkage happens because of the declaration, because the declaration also includes, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People includes the right to communication. Now, how that is enacted, how that actually happens, really varies, and there has been very, very little support from the state in terms of national training programs. And in the case of radio, because of the airways being licensed, pirate radio is often clandestine and persecuted and shut down. So it's a constant struggle, but also it's this resilience, this survivance of popping up over here, and one goes down here, but we pop up over there. So what's been happening now is there's a greater dialogue between that kind of transnational global indigenous movement, and we're almost seeing a transnational global indigenous cinema movement, though it still has fractures, and I think the language barrier is one of the toughest ones, because the lingua franca of sort of a more well-known indigenous cinema is still English, and it's still coming from countries in the developed world that have a more robust film policy. So here we have a Bolivian crew on the road working documenting in the Festival of CLACP when it hits Bolivia in 2008. And then we have the Continental Summit of Indigenous Communication of Abya Yala. So the word communication is really the binding element between that indigenous movement and the communication and visual component. So I want to start from where I'm from, southern Chile, where we have early video emerging in the 90s as well, in 95. And Janet Payan is an independent journalist who takes on filmmaking out of necessity. And I want to show a very brief clip of her first work, Punalca, with an interview by her just to set the stage and show a little bit what the stakes are. So let me just get going here. Okay. Okay. So instead of just creating a documentary that is expository of the conflict, she travels with the Mapuche poet Leonel Laf, and the film is entirely in the Mapuche language, and it is a poem about the spirit of the river. So it's about everything that is lost, everything that is affected when you affect the river. And in the clip, it closes with an image of the completed dam. That film is called Punalca El Alto Vio Vio, and even though we talk about documentary as kind of the weapon of choice for indigenous video, I would say that what we call a documentary really expands the limits of what we think of when we think of documentary. I think it's a hybrid documentary that often borders into poetry and spoken word and uses many other elements of indigenous storytelling. Also, it's important to note that because of dominant media either not covering these issues or covering them from a single perspective, indigenous video, the expressive qualities of it are often toned down because it often serves as newsreel. It often becomes crucial to even to bring to court, as we will see with the work of Heriberto Wallinga. Quechua director Heriberto Wallinga's community manifestos Sachatas Chipimatic Mani, I Am the Defender of the Forest, and Sisanyambi, The Path of Flowers, are made in Sarayaku, Ecuador, with support from external funding, but become award-winning works once they begin to circulate. In the documentary I Am the Defender of the Forest, it focuses on the struggle of the Quechua people of Sarayaku, who, like in other parts of the Amazon, have been imposed concessions from the government for oil prospecting. In 2002, the Argentinian oil company CGC invaded their territory, authorized by the Ecuadorian government, and the Quechua responded by pushing the company out. The community formed camps of peace and life, and small groups of community members, including mothers with small children, went through the jungle to intercept the parties of the company and the armed personnel, risking their lives in order to prevent them from destroying the land. The concession granted by the Ecuadorian state for an oil project that affected 65% of the people's traditional ancestral land was not informed, consulted to the community. And the film narrates the story, and the third film he makes, Children of the Jaguar, shows the whole journey of the community up to the highest, the Inter-American law courts.
Nosotros somos el pueblo originario quichua de Sarayaku. Aquí hemos nacido. Esta es nuestra casa. Se ubica en Ecuador y en la región amazónica. Este es nuestro territorio ancestral. estar. Hemos vivido aquí desde tiempos inmemoriales. En 2002, una compañía petrolera ingresó a nuestras tierras. El gobierno le había dado una licencia para explotar petróleo. Nosotros nos enteramos por el ruido de los helicópteros que aterrizaban en nuestro territorio. Toda nuestra vida se vio afectada en esos meses. No se molestaron en averiguar si este proyecto estaba de acuerdo con nuestras tradiciones y con nuestro modo de vida.
Siempre hemos visto en otras comunidades cuando entran abusivamente las empresas, destruyen el hogar, destruyen las comunidades.
Nosotros en Sarayaku decidimos que no podíamos dejar que esta injusticia se hiciera en realidad. Con nuestras acciones llegamos hasta la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos. Está en nuestra vida.
Vamos a mostrar que aquellos pueblos que han llorado, aquellos pueblos que han sido marginados, aquellos pueblos que lo han maltratado, lo han humillado, el pueblo de Sarayaku va a decir basta.
¿Qué va a pasar ahora cuando lleguemos a Costa Rica? Tendremos éxito con nuestro viaje.
It was a 7-year process before the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and then another 1.5 years before the court. A Yachak, or spiritual leader, was one of the 20-member delegation from Sarayaku that traveled to Costa Rica to testify. In response to questions regarding the impact of the oil company's activities on Sarayaku territory, Don Savino, the Yachak, said that half of the lords of the jungle were no longer there. Sarayaku is a living land. It is a living forest. There are trees and medicinal plants and all kinds of beings. Many hid, others died when it burst. They are the ones who maintain the jungle, the woods. If there is too much destruction, the mountains will also collapse. All of those who wish to cause damage, they don't understand what they are doing. We do understand because we see it. In the Sarayaku case, the court recognized the importance that sites of symbolic value have for the cultural identity of the Sarayaku people and for their worldview as a collective entity. Several of the statements and expert opinions presented during the proceedings indicate the strong bond that exists between the elements of nature and culture on the one hand, and each member of the people's sense of being. And this is part of the actual text of the court ruling. So this was a case where the film itself, I Am Defender of the Forest, was used in the case, in the successful case of the Sarayaku people against the state of Ecuador in territorial defense. And conflict is across all of Abya Yala. There is a case in southern Cauca in Colombia where we have the first regional indigenous organizations emerging in the 70s and 80s. To this day, right now, there is a face-off where water protectors are trying to protect springs that the government should have returned to them constitutionally, but a private owner is waiting for the government to pay him off. And they're on a constant standoff. It's kind of a low-intensity warfare situation, despite the peace process that the country is undergoing right now, right? So what we have here is the anti-riot squad guarding a dirt road on the side of a hill, and then the Indigenous Guard, which is again, a creative response. The Indigenous Guard of the Indigenous Regional Council of Cauca are men, women, and children. And their only weapon is a staff of authority that they teach the children from elementary school to have their roles in this organization. And the Indigenous Guard surrounds whatever manifestation, whatever march, and you can recognize them by the colors of the green and the red, or the blood and the land. And they are kind of always taking care of that the march is going peacefully, because they know that the minute they weaponize, they will be annihilated. Right? Despite that, a fellow radio producer from Radio Coconuco was recently shot while covering this conflict. And like I said, it's low intensity, and that doesn't mean that there isn't violence and that there isn't death. So Efigenia Vasquez of the Coconuco Nation was 31 years old, a mother of 3, and she was a radio host and producer. Every day, people would hear her voice on the air, and she was just doing her job. She went to cover this, and she was shot and killed. So it's still necessary to protect the protectors, to protect our own filmmakers, producers, journalists, radio folks. They're out there in the trenches, and they're often on the front line of territorial defense. There's the legal instruments, but there's also the on the ground, and who documents the on the ground struggle, and who captures these violations of human and territorial rights.
Quick question, what does ESMAD stand for?
ESMAD is the Anti-Riot Squad Mobile Unit. It's a translation from the acronym in Spanish.
And so that's part of the Colombian government, correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
So as the radio folks have decided that radio is something that can really reach people, so they have integrated some of the media. So the Indigenous Regional Organization, when you go on their website, you immediately start hearing the broadcast of live radio. And the way that they have defended this land occupation and the water has been, if the police come in at 3 a.m., somebody's always on the radio, and they call people out and say, we gotta go defend the land, and everybody gets up in the middle of the night and goes and defends it. So radio is really, really instrumental in the territorial defense in this particular region, but also because they're so prominent, they're always at risk. And whenever the police come into the village, the first place they hit is the radio station. So the body of work that emerges over the past 3 decades from Latin America or from Abya Yala is pretty much in the formats of that period: video, U-matic, beta. Who knows what formats the radio programs are on? Probably tape, right? So I wanted to end this presentation briefly, this kind of case study presentation, with the idea of that historical memory of the struggle of indigenous peoples, of indigenous knowledges, of indigenous languages, all on these formats that are perishing, right? And I consider that another form of threatened heritage. So a lot of people have passed on, but we have their stories, we have their voices, and we need to protect, we need to digitize, preserve, grant access, and make sure that the communities also get their voices back. Thank you.
So now it's my great pleasure to ask Theresa Pasqual from the Pueblo of Acoma, which I love very much, and it's a great pleasure to have you here with us here today, Theresa. Thank you.
Good morning. Give me a second here while we get set up. Oh, excellent. Take a picture of me drinking my coffee. Yes. You have my prior and informed consent to have my picture taken. Guadzi Hopa. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. First, thank you not only to the university, but to the Italian Academy for convening such an important discussion on the protection of sacred places to indigenous peoples at a time in which, for many of us who are in these home communities, has really been a seemingly unrelenting onslaught of loss and development of these places to different industries. I certainly hope that you have taken some time to read the biographies of the speakers today, and if you have, you will note that we come from a very diverse background. Had you asked me 30 years ago if this is the work that I would be doing, I would have answered no. It was certainly not in my vision to be doing this particular type of work. However, I can probably safely say that most of us who do this particular work, and however, in whichever format we do it in, certainly have felt that we have been called to do this work on behalf of the ancestors. And so, as all things began in our Pueblo communities, when I was growing up, there was never a direct answer to any question that I ever posed to my father. And for my relations who are in the room, who are of Pueblo descent, will know that anytime you pose a question to any elder or a parent or a grandparent, they take you back to the beginning before they even get to answering your question. So in that fine Pueblo tradition, before we can even begin to talk about some of the issues, it is my intent to take you back first before we begin to talk about the present. And so part of that going back to the beginning really takes us back to our origin stories, how we see ourselves in relation to the universe. And all Pueblo origin stories have their variations. We are not all the same. You will find literature that tries to consolidate us into one pan Pueblo origin story, and that is not the case. So this very broad and generalized telling of what that origin story is reflective of what I know from my father. And of course, these stories take much more time than we have to tell. And they are only told during certain times of the season. But it begins with two women, not just one, but two. And the two women were sisters. And the sisters came into knowing in a place of darkness. And in that knowing, they began to become aware of their relationship to each other and the relationship to where their education, their knowing was first beginning. It is at that point in which they become aware of each other that they emerge onto what we now know as the present day world. And in this series of tellings, the sisters then are given the knowledge to their relationship of the world around them, their relationship to the sun and the moon, the relationship to the cycles of the movements of the sun and the stars. But they also come into a world where it was still, the English translation would be, the closest English translation would be that the world was still spongy. It was still damp, raw, that it hadn't been fully formed yet. So the sisters, as part of this, as part of our history, as part of our origin story, then are given the things that will formulate and populate the world. Things that we begin to see, such as the plants and the animals, our references to the landscape, the rivers, the mountains, all of those things come into being. But it was at this point in which we refer to broadly as this place called Ship Up. You will oftentimes see that in literature, in very spellings and definitions. For my people, we generally say that's to the north. A precise location is not something that we discuss of where Ship Up is, but we generally refer to it to those lands of Utah and Colorado, some of the very landscapes that we'll be talking about today. Along with the emergence of those two sisters and the things that would sustain our people throughout the countless generations, are the beginnings then of the core values that we have as Pueblo people. The core values that begin to guide our communities, begin to shape our relationships to each other as family, each other as a larger community, and each other in terms of our connection to the natural world. This particular slide tries to give an idea of how that flows. It's difficult in 20 minutes to try and give an adequate experience or introduction into a Puebloan world view. However, I've tried my best to highlight some of those things that are important in terms of core values. However, the one value that I really want to highlight is that value of stewardship, and that's going to be talked about a little bit as we go in through these slides. Those values are expressed in what we now see present day in our language, in our songs, in our prayers, as Kevin expressed this morning, are all expressions of those core values that were with us at the time of emergence. They are expressed throughout the seasons, and if you talk to Pueblo people, directionally as well. So there's always a sense of where are we in relation to each other. We then begin to see a change. Again, our time is short, and so I will not go into the longer history of the new people's arrivals, the new values and beliefs that come with them. But it's important to begin to see this shift. The shift for not only our Pueblo peoples and indigenous peoples as a whole, but to also recognize the different value systems and beliefs that come in. When you look at 1689 and the arrival of the Spanish, you really began to see that a new value system of ownership comes in. This transition from stewardship of how we perceive our interaction with the land and the resources to a change into a more of a ownership format, and a format in which priority is placed on property rights. And so you began to see title given, which begins this movement of the loss of ancestral lands, the removal then of seeing indigenous people as the other, and with that othering, then a movement towards keeping people in a confined space. If we move forward through the historical timeline, we began to see that there is a whole explosion of federal laws that began to shift again how we manage and how we interact with land and sacred places. Of course, these laws that are still on the books today are founded on the basis of really, again, taking or controlling the unknown, in this case, the lands that were out west, that were still wild and free and untamed. A lot of those, if you look at the historical documents and the discussions that went on, it was a fear of the unknown. This idea that if you put a fence around it, if you put a boundary around it, that somehow we could contain the unknown, the wilderness. And one of those interesting articles that I've always read and refer back to is really the bottom one, which is the creation of the Wilderness Act, this idea that to tame the wilderness by taking man out of the environment, that somehow we would make the environment better by that. And in that case, when they're talking about the removal of man, it really is talking about the removal of indigenous peoples that still occupied the landscape at the time. As you know, probably throughout the history of the United States, there has been the removal of indigenous peoples, this attempt to try and corral us into what we now know as the reservation system. Many of our people still reside, I reside within a reservation. The Acoma Reservation is a little bit different than other reservations and how they were created. The pueblos in New Mexico were a bit more fortunate than our other indigenous brothers and sisters across the United States in that for better or for worse, we were recognized as having an organized system of governance in place at the time that Spanish and Mexico came in. And at that time, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, it actually included a provision in there that would allow Pueblo people to stay on their lands that they occupy at the time. Unlike many of our indigenous brothers and sisters in the United States who were forcefully removed, we still stay somewhat close to those ancestral lands. But over the years, different attempts to consolidate or erode what was the original homelands of the various Pueblo communities in New Mexico has significantly decreased what those lands are today. One other note before we move forward is really a lot of these federal laws are founded on the belief of this the belief that came about that man somehow had the power to hold dominion over not only the animals and the wildlife, but also the land itself. Rather than being a steward of or caretaker of these particular resources. Our Pueblo people have often looked at ourselves really as the caretakers of. It's one of our responsibilities as was set forth for us at the point of creation, and that we don't have a right to own. We generally stay away from the word ownership, but that we hold things in as a collective. If we were beginning to see some of that movement over time, you begin to see, if we looked at the center of this diagram, where we would place the core values of our people and look at the periods of time across this country for how it has treated indigenous peoples, you begin to see these periods that we refer to in history as periods of assimilation, of termination, of relocation. And each one of those periods in this country has worked to erode the ability of our Pueblo people, of indigenous peoples here in the United States, to maintain access to land, to maintain our language, to maintain the things that will sustain us into the future. Now we go into a little bit of what I do. And while I won't go into great detail of all the nuances of being a practitioner of historic preservation law, because that will take a whole nother day, I will, yeah, that takes you way back. I will certainly tell you that in the United States, we have a slew of development that triggers numerous processes under federal law. And this by no means is anywhere near any of a complete list of any of those processes. But there are common triggers to the application of those federal processes. And things that we even think as green development, even solar and wind energy. Oh, that reads solar and solar. I just caught that now. So that's not correct, but it should read solar and wind. Types of green energy that we think of now even have impacts to traditional lands of Pueblo people and other indigenous peoples. This, if you are a practitioner of Section 106 or any of these federal processes, gives you an idea. You will recognize this well. There are two particular laws that always get called out here in the United States. Section 106 is the section out of the National Historic Preservation Act. It is the process that allows for the evaluation and for determination of impacts to properties that may be determined of historical or cultural value. Another one is the NEPA process, and that comes out from the Environmental Protection Act. And it's a process, again, used to evaluate, determine, and make a decision. Now, well, I, again, won't go into all the details of how this works, because you can look that up online yourself. I want to note one thing that stands out in this, is that these are very linear processes. When you look at these processes, which is what federal agencies in this country do to evaluate a proposed undertaking and how it has the potential to impact historic and cultural properties in the United States, you will note that it is a flow chart that is very linear. It is designed to get you from point B all the way down to the end. In my Pueblo community, and I suspect in many indigenous communities, we are not linear in our thinking nor linear in our processes. You can plug in a variable at the beginning and come out not with one answer, you can come out with 5, 10, 20 answers. And each one of those answers is correct. But the thought processes and the thinking that have been established force the practitioner to come to one answer alone. And that answer then is what is used, that information is what is used then to make the final decision by a federal agency on many of these large-scale landscape development projects. Now, I also know as a practitioner in this particular field that what you can also see happen is that oftentimes agencies will try and force a pan-Indian, pan-collective answer because the system's not set up to handle the variables. It's frightening to those that have to use this process to try and figure out how do we streamline the different variables as part of this process. And those variables could include tangible properties, intangible properties, things that are considered sacred, things that are hard to define and quantify. This process is not set up for that. And so when you have that, oftentimes people will tend to exclude and not to include them in the process. So what you see in some of those final documents and reports is something that lacks a lot of critical information to be used in making those large decision-making decisions by federal agencies. Of course, there are a slew of laws in the United States. The baby of all these laws is, of course, NAGPRA, which Honor alluded to. Again, you can read up on all the details of those laws, but NAGPRA really is one of the baby of the laws. Well, right now it's in its adolescence, probably. It's growing up since 1990. It's past its teens. And it's not a perfect law. It's not a perfect law. It had great intent, great vision, but it also has its limitations. But as we begin to apply these laws and we realize their limitations, we oftentimes, as practitioners, find ourselves looking more like this within that process. I use this illustration because it has been my experience that over time, when you come into a project and everybody's got 3 lawyers on their arms, you know it's not going to go well. And I've definitely seen projects that have ended up in that far slide there, which are few and far between, but it does get very difficult. So it's not always all doom and gloom, and yes, there are limitations on the laws that we have available to us here in the United States. And I can't move forward without mentioning the fact that if there was a nemesis in the United States that was mine, and mine alone, it would be called the 1872 Mining Act. That is the law that is currently on the books in the United States that actively is used by industry and those who seek to develop many of these sacred places. 1872, just kind of let that sink in. 1872, we weren't even thinking about half the things that we're thinking about now in the present day and the impacts to many of these places in 1872. The attitudes and beliefs that were around in 1872 are definitely, I would hope, not the intent and the vision of people of this country when we talk about the protection of these lands. And so I can't go without saying that if there was ever one law that needs to be taken off the books, rewritten, completely abolished, use whatever terminology you want, it is the 1872 Mining Act. Now, again, it is not all doom and gloom, although some days it seems more doom and more gloom than others. However, I like to think that protesting is part of our DNA, and it's been part of our DNA since 1680 and even beyond that. Certainly, protest is not new to Pueblo people. Since the arrival of the Spanish, as they came searching for their cities of gold, following lore, following who knows what, our people have fought to push back against the systems and the ideas and the beliefs that have followed the arrival of these new people. And Pueblo people have been fighting continuously to preserve their way of life. As a student of archaeology, we can look at the architecture. Some people like to refer to them as ancestral ruins. I, however, refer to them as our home dwelling places. They were not something that we simply left behind. We had the intent to return to. But if we look and study how homes were created, how places were used, we began to see in the much later architecture a movement to preserve ways of life that take us underground. And so what was once above ground and very prominent and visible to the public then starts to go subsurface and underground, where ceremonial places are not so much isolated, but in certain instances are incorporated right next to dwelling structures, and made to, in certain instances, blend in, so you begin not to see. And there have been examples of success and failures in all of these different protests over time. Certainly, Oñate did not expect when he went to go avenge the death of his nephew there at Acoma, who a nephew who had come to Acoma with very bad intentions against the people and actually violated a woman there and lost his life there as part of his poor decision-making to take advantage of the people there. Oñate didn't realize the strength of the Acoma people, and so war ensued at Acoma Pueblo, at my village, in which of course the Acoma people paid a heavy price for it. And in our literature that you can read, you will definitely find the story of how the Acoma men, after the defeat by the Spanish, lost their foot. Each foot of the warriors of a certain age was cut off as punishment for the killing of Oñate's nephew. But these are stories that teach us, even in failures, can teach us some very core lessons. And one of those successes that is probably more well known across this country is the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which was led by Popé, a Pueblo man from Okeowinge, to overthrow the Spanish at the time. And in this country, what is notable about this is two things. The first is that the Pueblo people at that time had the ability, the knowledge, and the foresight to be able to organize and plan a resistance over a span of land, because all our Pueblo people weren't living next door to each other. There was quite a distance between Pueblo communities. But to be able to organize and plan this push of and defeat of the Spanish. So in 1680, as the Spanish were imposing their new rule, their new belief system, Popé and others came together to make the decision in prayer and much thought to organize the Pueblos to resist the Spanish. And in 1680, they successfully fought the Spanish and pushed them back into their territory. And it is in this country one of the only successful resistance efforts to push out a colonizer out of ancestral lands. Over the years, in those periods that I noted in that chart of assimilation, relocation, and termination, the DNA of active protest saw a period of dormancy in our lives. We, over the cumulative impacts of those periods, really saw a suppression of active protest. But when you look into the periods after World War II, which was the generation of my father was a World War II veteran, in which he fought in a war that did not recognize him fully as a citizen and did not allow him to vote. You began to see a shift in this country where we start to talk about the overall movement towards civil rights and equality that begins to include a conversation with many indigenous peoples in this country, recognizing that we as indigenous people, as Pueblo people, were not afforded those same rights. And you begin to see individuals across Indian country who began to acquire the knowledge of the systems of oppression in this country that began to shift that movement to change the discussion that then allows us citizenship, that allows, of course, the right to vote, many other federal laws, Indian laws and acts that give us the ability to self-govern ourselves come out of those movements. What we see now in the present day and age, and of course, as Standing Rock has filled the media a little bit too late, but has filled the conversation across the country about impacts of oil into the United States, we began to see a resurgence by young people dipping into that wealth of strength of protest that began in 1680. This acknowledgement that our forefathers were successful in 1680, why can we not bring that forward and use that in active protest? And so you begin to see movements such as Honor Noted. This one is particular close to my heart. It's the protection of Mount Taylor against uranium extraction. Mount Taylor, I have a view of this mountain every single morning, so I'm blessed. Yeah, Mount Taylor sits on one of the largest deposits of uranium ore. And so there are active fights by young people and pueblos and communities and tribes to protect such places. Other places of protest and protection here in New Mexico or there in New Mexico, of course, are places that may not seem as grand as, say, Chaco Canyon or Bear's Ears or the Grand Staircase, Escalante, but are just as significant. This was a fight to protect the petroglyph monument. Well, it wasn't a monument then, but it's the petroglyphs on the west side of Albuquerque. It was being destroyed for development of the city west. And so what you see in the photographs is the construction of the road and the loss of land and the subsequent development of that road. And you can begin to see that development has creeped right up to the volcanic mesas there. And all of that brings increased traffic and people into places which were normally protected by the fact that they were rural in nature. Of course, while we are here, we can't go without talking about Chaco. Chaco, again, is one of those places referred to by my people as Wa'ashbashaka. It's a name that describes the features of that particular place. To note at this point, if you look at that far image to the right, the purple image is Chaco Canyon, the park proper. That's the boundary. At this point, currently 90%, over 90% of the lands, I think it's like 92% now, of the lands are currently already leased for oil and gas exploration. If you were to take a trip out to Chaco at this point, I was there this past week, you will actively see oil and gas flaring on the landscape. Many of the open landscapes that are north of Chaco proper are dotted with the oil and gas wells, the pump jacks, the flaring, the trucks. It's incredible in such a short period of time how much development has occurred. And although we have a current deferment on this past lease by the Secretary of Interior, it is only a deferment. It's not a withdrawal. And while many people were happy with the decision by the Secretary of Interior, we also know that there will be more to come. One of the women that I hold in high esteem, and I'm sure that many of you know, is Dolores Huerta, who is an organizer. She's a powerful woman. She is, in my eyes, somebody that if I aspired to be, I would want her strength and her fortitude that comes with her. But one of the things in a conversation with her when she was speaking in Santa Fe not too long ago, she was talking about her own experiences in active protest in this country. And one of the things that she noted in her remarks is that protest is just noise without the following, and that you cannot have protest unless you as a community organize. and that you can't organize and turn that power into success unless you turn that into active votes. And that without active voting, all of those things are null unless you turn that into action. And so we as Pueblo people, given all our experiences with protesting around the protection of many of these issues, and even much like 1680, although we voted with our feet back then, now it's a different system, we have been engaged in that very same dynamic of protest, organization, voting, and action, and it continues to this day. If you go into Pueblo communities, you will see a resurgence of an effort to register our Pueblo people to vote in the United States. We have not been active voters. We're still new to the process. Because really it isn't until the 1920s, later on in the 1920s that we received the citizenship, and much later that we received the right to vote. But of these images, the most powerful images are the ones of people running for office, our own Pueblo people running for office, as is noted by Representative Derek Lente, who won a seat there in the state of New Mexico, and our own Pueblo people, young and old, getting out to register people to vote. We have active organizations of gathering people to protest, as is noted in the Chaco flyer here. And we have people who are moved to action. This image is one of the images that I hold near and dear to my heart. One, because that came out of the successful designation of Mount Taylor as the traditional cultural property there in New Mexico. But it features a lot of our appointed leadership, not only of Pueblo people, but we also have Navajo people that are in there. And that is one thing that I want to make a note as we are having this discussion, is that many of our collective efforts that we have seen success on culminate with different tribal people who have different origin stories, who may have historically been in conflict with each other, because we as Pueblo people didn't always associate with Navajo people or Ute people or Apache people. We were often warring with each other. But there has to come a point in which someone serves as the nexus to move us beyond those points of conflict and say, where are the points where we can move forward as a collective? And when you do that, in this case with Mount Taylor in that image on the bottom, when you do that, you can see success. And as I bring my presentation to a close, I'd like to highlight a couple of things. And these are why it is important to actively protect these landscapes. We do not have the luxury of moving to new places. Unlike most people in the United States, we cannot pick up a village or a reservation and move it to a new place once those resources are gone. The balance of our community is critical because if we destroy those resources, it impacts not only our spiritual well-being, but our identity for our young people, our well-being mentally and spiritually. But most importantly for me, as I watch my family's grandchildren grow up, it is the continuation of our oral history. We as Pueblo people do not have our history written in an encyclopedia or a history book. So once the land itself is changed or destroyed, we have lost the pages of that history book, and it cannot be replaced. Languages and traditions that make us who we are at a point in which they are being threatened and sometimes in certain cases even lost. The last image of my presentation is something that I wanted to share with you from Regis Pecos as the former governor of Cochiti, and he wrote this, and I leave you with this as the final point. He says, the well-being of all things is to understand that it begins with each one of us, beginning with nurturing our inner spirit, our conscious. When we consciously nurture our inner spirit, our physical well-being will be guided by our core values. Our physical, spiritual, and mental well-being contributes to the health of our family and our communities. When the family is healthy and strong, the spirit of our communities will flourish and be vibrant. This vibrant spirit in turn nourishes the environment, which is the womb of our existence. And so I leave you with that and ask you, what will your contribution be? Thank you.
No. I want to introduce Sandy Grandy. I'm really happy she's here. As I mentioned earlier, she was felled by one of the usual winter ailments. She made it up, but on the other hand, some people made it up from Acoma. Other people, I think, made it up from Connecticut College, where she is director of the Center for the Critical Study of Race and Ethnicity. So a bit like Elsa, her experience ranges very widely away from Native Americans across the world, but she is also, despite what I just said, she's just recently had the 10th anniversary edition of her great book, Red Pedagogy. We like that, Red Pedagogy, for all kinds of reasons. Red Pedagogy, Native American Social and Political Thought. So we're very happy to have Sandy here today. She sounds in perfectly good voice, so it's my great pleasure to have her speak to us now. Sandy. No, I took your talk away. Always a test.
On another day, I might be able to swing that, but not today. Thank you. It's an honor and privilege to be here as a guest on Lenape territory. Special thanks to David for bringing us all together, and the folks of the Italian Academy, especially Alice and Jeffrey, I think, who was instrumental in doing a lot of the arrangements. I really appreciate that. I also think in the aftermath, maybe, of the whole New York Monument revisiting thing, that it's an interesting and important political statement that the Italian Academy holds this conference. So doubly appreciated for that. Sorry. Pasamukwe, good afternoon. My name is Sandy Grande. I'm Quechua from Orcatuna. So as you can probably tell, I've been battling the flu. I actually had the grave misfortune of contracting both strands successively. I caught the first one on a recent trip to New Zealand, and the second one upon return. On the one hand, it's been really awful to be sick for this long, but at some point, I also just decided to succumb and think about what I might be meant to learn from this experience. So my remarks today are somewhat autoethnographic, weaving in my current condition with my thoughts on water and its teachings, or water epistemologies. It's likely I caught the first strand of the virus on the 21-hour-plus flight to New Zealand, where I was headed to, among other things, participate on a decolonizing water panel with my comrade, Elena Eagleshield. Small, but Elena's the second one from the left there. She was a young woman who started the Defending the Water School at the Oceti-Sakowin prayer camp at Standing Rock. On the flight, I watched the movie The Shape of Water, this year's Oscar winner for Best Picture and Director. Now, it could have been the sleep deprivation, but I have to say, after watching it, I really didn't get what all the hoopla was about. It's also not the kind of film I think you watch on that little 5x7 airplane screen, but I was intrigued. As soon as and on the other slide there is not the best slide, but it's from the Defenders of the Water School on the ground at Standing Rock. As soon as I arrived in Aotearoa, oops, it's not quite the right one. Yeah, that's the shape of water. As soon as I arrived in Aotearoa, I went for a nice walk down to the Waikato River, and on my way back, I was met by the rains. Initially, just the softest of sprinkles, what we would call a female rain, gentle and light, like wet kisses on your skin. Then when I was about 50 feet from my home away from home, the deluge came. Both of the rains felt like assurances, a reminder about what to keep at the forefront at my mind during my stay. Water is life. I don't know if you can see, too, the other thing that struck me on my walks, this is really a slide from my walk, because they've gotten so much rain, actually, this spring in Aotearoa, and particularly in this area, everything was more green than usual. And so the trees were more lush than usual. So while I was getting rained on, the trees, because of their lushness, you can see where it's really dry and then wet and then dry and then wet. So if I felt like I needed a little bit of a reprieve, I felt very protected by the trees in a moment when I might not otherwise been protected by the trees because of the rains that had come, because of water. And then I got sick. Last year, Water is Life became the anthem of water protectors at Standing Rock and across the nation. It's a phrase I've probably said 1,000,000 times. And while it's something that I know intellectually, I'm not sure I always feel it in a visceral sense, what it means. We are, after all, about 78% water. But while I was sick, and I won't go into the gory details, let's just say I became more acutely aware of just how much of my body is fluids of various kinds. I also re-experienced how, in the depths of a high fever, the taste of cold water on the tongue is nothing but pure medicine. How frozen water wrapped in a saturated cloth can feel like religious deliverance on my forehead. And throughout it all, I got tons of text messages from the States and beyond. Drink fluids, stay hydrated, make sure you drink lots of water. Water is life. Throughout this time, I've also been reminded of what a privilege it is to have access to clean water, to drink, to take hot showers in, to freeze. But increasingly, this isn't the case. Currently, half of the world's aquifers are being depleted beyond repair. Already, 21 of the largest 37 have reached their tipping point. Even before the Trump regime took office and makes good on its aims to gut clean water standards, we've been headed toward what some are calling a post-water world, one that would undoubtedly be replete with water generals and government rations. And it isn't rocket science to figure out who will be doing the rationing and who will be the rationed. Water is life. It's common parlance to say we have a water crisis, but we don't really. What we have is a crisis of capitalist greed, a crisis of extraction, a crisis of overaccumulation, of uncaring, unknowing, and disavowal. The main culprits are a handful of global corporations and 1%ers. There's talk that Nestle and Coca-Cola, along with other US and European-based corporations, are engaged in efforts to buy the Guanare Aquifer, named after the Guanare peoples, giving them exclusive rights for over 100 years. While that remains unconfirmed, it is a fact that George W. Bush has already bought 300,000 acres in the Chaco region of Paraguay, land that rests atop the Acuífero Guanare, one of the largest freshwater aquifers in the world. Similarly, billionaire T. Boone Pickens currently owns more water rights than any other individual in the US, which is about enough to drain approximately 65 billion gallons a year. They will be the rationers. At the same time the new water barons are buying up the world's aquifers, governments are limiting the average citizen's ability to become water self-sufficient. Consider, for example, the landmark case of Gary Harrington, a farmer in Oregon who was recently convicted and jailed for collecting rainwater on his own property. And of course, there's Standing Rock, the Huma Nation's fight against the Bayou Pipeline, the Little Creek Camp protest site in Iowa, and sadly, the list goes on and on. So what we've created is a situation where individual billionaires and corporations can own more water rights than some small countries, while ordinary citizens are criminalized for collecting rainwater, and indigenous peoples are still in the way, set in the sights of elimination. Indeed, indigenous peoples are almost always on the front lines. Coca-Cola is using so much water in Chiapas that the indigenous residents are being forced to buy bottled water, or in some instances, Coke, over water since it's cheaper. Their water rights were sold out by their own president, Vicente Fox, who prior to becoming head of state was the CEO of, anybody know? The Coca-Cola Company. The material realities of this arrangement impacts the health and well-being of everyone, but especially indigenous communities, leading to everything from tooth decay to diabetes. And more destruction is coming. Last year, the Keystone Pipeline linked 210,000 gallons of oil in South Dakota. Already, the Dakota Access Pipeline has leaked 5 times, and tribal officials report that DAPL hasn't prepared a spill model or proper emergency response plan as required by the Army Corps of Engineers. We are the rationed. Water is life. In many sites around the world, indigenous women are at the center of the struggles for water. We are the protectors of water. If earth is woman and water is the lifeblood of earth, then women are water and water is life. Water is both a relation and a responsibility. In this sense, climate change is not simply about science or an issue of access or rights. Rather, it's a condition that impacts the quality of relationships that constitute what Kyle White refers to as collective continuance. Maintaining these complex sets of relations requires that we be attentive to the teachings of water, to water epistemologies. I think I'm skipping slides here. For those of you who don't know, this is Anishinaabe woman, grandmother Josephine, who maybe started 5 years ago walking the perimeter. She's well into her 70s, maybe even 80s at this point, walking the perimeter of the Great Lakes, carrying water literally as part of a ceremony. Water can be a gentle rain, a ripple, or a body enveloping cocoon. Some babies are born moving from womb to bathwater. Water can also be a tsunami, a tidal wave of destruction, moments that in the short run seem only ruinous, but in the long run operate to bring or restore balance. Huracan is a god of creation. Most importantly, though, water teaches us about connections. Its divided but related bodies connects lands and communities across the globe. It also creates systems and networks of interdependency. Every living being needs water, is water, belongs to water. The ability to maintain these relations, to maintain balance, is critical to indigenous collective continuance. These are the relations that settler logics of capitalist accumulation and extraction sever. Forms of dispossession that remove peoples from their traditional territories and thereby limit access to ancestral lands and waters not only significantly impacts the social, political, and economic systems of indigenous communities, but also their ceremonial practices, which is to say their relations. In this sense, while the problematic of water is deeply shaped by treaties, laws, policies, and their associated rights and justice discourses, I want to underscore that the pedagogical is also at stake. That is, the processes by which we learn and pass on indigenous knowledges that sustain our collective continuity. The pedagogical is often dismissed in scholarly circles as not serious, as the domain of women and children, as the domain of the effective, as an acquired skill and not an academic discipline and therefore not intellectual. Like land and water, the pedagogical is feminized. This manipulation of power incites relations of control, of violation, of abuse. So it isn't just land and water that gets destroyed, but their teachings as well. This is not only of consequence to Native peoples, because I argue that the same settler logics that are in play to currently disappear us are in play to disappear the humanities. are the reason for the manufactured STEM crisis and the over-reliance on species standardized testing and accountability schemes that have virtually removed social studies and the arts from public school curricula. The not-so-tacit message is the only way to know water is as a specimen to be studied or a commodity to be distributed or hoarded. This is too small, but consider, for example, that the North Dakota Schools National Math and Science Initiative is being funded by ExxonMobil. That's the slide on the left. To the tune of $50 million. And remember, this is where most Lakota children are schooled. I'm also thinking about MIT's recent announcement of the Solve Fellowship. That's the slide on the right. That will, quote, support outstanding members of the Echeti community who have tested projects that bring renewable energy, food, and or water to the community and contribute to economic prosperity and sovereignty. Doesn't sound terrible. But what does a fellowship actually get you? As far as I can see, each fellow will get a, quote, all expenses paid trip to MIT for 4 days, during which they will, quote, find partners among the 350 plus attendees from the corporate, foundation, nonprofit, and academic sectors. So it seems to be more about networking than anything else, because how can you develop a project in 4 days? And this, the Solve Fellowships, is happening at the same time MIT has been recently awarded $3 billion to operate a new military R&D lab, contracted to apply advanced technology to the problems of national security. To quote Glenn Couthard, author of Redskins, White Masks, he says, for indigenous nations to live, capitalism must die. And that's probably the most oft-quoted quote from Gwen's book. But the second half of that often gets left off. And for capitalism to die, we must actively participate in the construction of indigenous alternatives to it. And so we persist. As indigenous women, we live our responsibility to protect water. We do this in a variety of ways. We are warriors, we pray, we conduct ceremonies, we are engineers, we are agricultural workers, scholars, teachers, mothers, caregivers, organizers, and all of our work is political. As we persist, it's important to keep in mind, as others have mentioned, that we draw upon a vast repository of ancestral knowledge. For example, over 600 years ago, the indigenous peoples of Peru constructed a vast and complex series of aqueducts, irrigation systems, canals, and fountains that sustained their agricultural as well, their communities as well as their cities. Every person in the empire had access to clean water. Today, many communities faced with displacement due to water loss, mostly due to the loss of glacial ice, are resurrecting some of these traditional practices. It's also critical that we continue to reach out and build coalition with all communities where water is threatened, from Echeti to Flint, Michigan, from Quito to Cauca. We too march for our lives. And here I have to say that I still have faith that the young people from Parkland will soon learn how gun control is related to state violence, and state violence to indigenous dispossession and black killings. And we should all help teach them. Finally, it's important to remember that water, Yaku, has its own life, its own shape, which brings me back to the movie. After having some time to marinate on it, I think the film The Shape of Water is about decolonial love. In the movie, a closeted gay artist, a mute white woman and her African-American co-worker, and a Russian spy all end up colluding with each other for a single cause: to save life. One they don't know or even understand. Some are killed in the process, and others are saved. So the message seems to be that to work together, to conspire, to collude, requires that we work past our profound differences. I didn't say look past. So this is not a call to join the neoliberal chorus of can't we all just get along or to be colorblind. The characters are actually well aware of their differences and the ways in which they are marked and limited by them. But in the end, they build on each other's strengths. that are only visible to them, which is critical because the powers that be never saw it coming, because they never saw them, and they certainly never saw them working together. They came together because they realized that the failure to do so meant death. In a moment of fear and doubt about putting one's life on the line to save another, one character says, "He's not even human." But his friend responds, "And if we do nothing, neither are we." So in the struggles ahead, we might get killed, but we might also find ourselves or return to ourselves or even leave ourselves to join another world or way of being. Decolonial love is water. Water is life.
So it's now my pleasure to introduce, now back to the nitty-gritty, Rollie Wilson, who is attorney for the Ute Indian Tribe at Frederick Peebles and Morgan in Washington, D.C. So he's the real thing, a real lawyer in Washington who is working for the Ute Indian Tribe. Rollie, where are you? Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm so thankful we took that little break a few minutes ago. Thank you for inviting everybody to get up. As you know, I'm the one standing between you all and lunch and a lively discussion, I hope. So I hope we have time for that. And I'm looking forward to that. As mentioned, my name is Rollie Wilson. I'm an attorney for the Ute Indian Tribe. I'm based in Washington, D.C. Our firm has offices throughout Indian country. And I'm really thankful to be here today, and I've really appreciated the interdisciplinary discussion that we're having. I'm doing the legal stuff. Other folks have been talking about ideas and language and land, and I really love combining those things and bringing those ideas together. So the Ute Indian Tribe, they're one of the 5 tribes of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. This is an organization that came together to advocate for the establishment of the Bears Ears Monument, working with grassroots organizations who had been involved for almost a decade, even going back to Senator Bennett from Utah, to establish a sacred place, an area in southeastern Utah that would be managed according to tribal cultural values and highlight the tribal resources in the area. Let me make sure I know how to work this thing. Whoops. Okay, so this gathering of 5 tribes we've all recognized was a historic gathering. It's not every day that Indian tribes, sovereign Indian nations, government-to-government relationships get together to work together for one common purpose like this. It was a historic gathering, and I apologize, let me back up just a little bit. Unfortunately, the business committee, the Ute Indian Tribe's business committee couldn't be here today, and so they asked me to speak on their behalf, but they greatly thank the organizers for the invitation, the Italian Academy and Columbia University, and they wish they could be here. They have really busy schedules. Like state governments, the national government, they're there managing their homelands, making decisions, voting on things, and unfortunately could not get out here for this event. But they did wish they could be here. And they asked me to speak on their fight to protect their tribal homelands and sacred sites and cultural resources. And so let's start with Bears Ears. The tribe was a member of the is a member of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, which also includes the Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, the Pueblo of Zuni, and then the Ute Indian Tribe, who I represent. So I don't need to tell you, you all know, President Obama established the Bears Ears National Monument towards the end of his term in December of 2016, if I'm remembering correctly. Thank you. And of course, this was done under the Antiquities Act, and it was the first monument done specifically to protect the tribal cultural and traditional values in the area. It was done with a tribal, I always wanted to call it co-management. The White House kept telling me, don't call it that, don't call it that. But to me, it was always a tribal co-management provision in which the tribes would influence and help direct the management of the area through the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, as well as, of course, the vast archaeological resources that cover the area and that were to be protected under the Antiquities Act. In the few months that we had before President Trump came in and took his action, the commission got together, they got rules together for how they were going to work together. Each of the tribe elected their representatives, and they began discussing management priorities for the Bears Ears National Monument. They began meeting with the BLM, they began meeting with the Forest Service, and putting those ideas together to establish a tribal management plan for this area, this important area. So then in December 4th, 2017, President Trump took his action to dismantle and revoke the monument, and also to severely limit the ability of the commission to have a tribal impact on this area. As you know, the size was greatly reduced by 85%, and the tribal commission now only works on, at least under President Trump's action, now only works on one small part of the monument, again buried under layers of monument bureaucracy, if you will. Monumental bureaucracy. Should have used that. That would have been good. So the Ute Indian Tribe, oh darn, that didn't come out quite as good as I was hoping. The Ute Indian Tribe's reservation is up here, kind of in what you'd call northeastern Utah. This is actually basically the outline of kind of the western side of the reservation. And then there's kind of a large square area over here, which is the eastern side of the reservation. But as you can see in this pink area here, this represents ancestral lands for the Incomparable band of Ute Indians, which north of the San Juan River here is about where Bears Ears is located. And so the Ute Indian Tribe, along with the 4 other tribes, as well as other tribes that weren't a part of the coalition, all have an ancestral connection to these lands. They have herbs and resources there that they would gather, sacred places that they would go to maintain cultures, and that they still do. Somebody earlier today mentioned the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 106 protection. Of course, in my view as an attorney, the most important part of that is the recognition of traditional cultural properties, which is not just the historic value of something, but as well as its ongoing value, its connection to living, thriving tribal cultures. And so NHPA, the National Historic Preservation Act, can be used not to just protect things from the past, but also ongoing uses. And that's an important thing, and similar to what we're doing here with Bears Ears National Monument. It's not just to protect antiquities, but also current lively uses of the tribes that are essential to their cultural connection, not just to the land in this area, but also to the tribes. So, sorry, I was going to tell you a little bit about these maps. This is the Royce map for the state of Utah. Charles Royce in the 1890s went around the country and compiled these maps of Indian land cessions based on treaties and agreements with the United States. And these maps are still used today by the National Park Service. You all are probably familiar with the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. If somebody accidentally finds something when they're digging up land to put in a Walmart or whatever, they go and look at these maps to figure out which tribes may be connected to a particular area and who the letters need to go out to sort of identify the objects or the remains that have been found and who they should be returned to. So these maps created in the 1890s are still used today and represent sort of legally binding obligations for the U.S. government to who they need to involve in a particular area. And the Ute Indian Tribe uses these maps to remind people of the extent of their ancestral lands. So, let's see. Okay, so the same day that President Trump took his action to rescind, revoke, dismantle, whatever verb you want to use there, the Bears Ears National Monument, the 5 tribes of the coalition, again working together, filed their case against his unlawful action in federal district court in D.C. This case is still in its super preliminary stages. The United States Department of Justice is trying to get the case removed from the D.C. courts and out to the Utah courts. They think they'll probably get a better judge out there. Our argument is, of course, these are are decisions that have a national impact, were made actually in DC, and so the review of the courts should be done in DC. The other thing that we're doing in addition to litigation is the 5 tribes, as well as the Ute Indian Tribe on its own, have been working on Capitol Hill to prevent other attacks on tribal lands related to the Bears Ears National Monument. Most of this comes from one person in particular, although I guess he's got his team on the Senate side, the Utah delegation in general. Congressman Rob Bishop on the House side, he's the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, and has been pushing through all kinds of legislation attacking tribal lands. Bears Ears is just his latest attempt. So just after the holidays, after President Trump had taken his unlawful action, the next January, Congressman Bishop started holding hearings on a bill. Actually, it was going to be just one hearing on a bill that would legislatively approve President Trump's action. And it's hard enough to get the president to do something. If you can also get Congress to do something, then the ability to undo that stuff and get back to the original Bears Ears Monument becomes even more difficult. So the Ute Indian Tribe spends a lot of its resources in Congress fighting against what Chairman Bishop is trying to do through his chairmanship of the House Natural Resources Committee. It's also interesting to note that Congressman Bishop is actually, his district actually includes most of the Ute Indian Tribe's reservation. So he is the tribe's representative in Congress, and frankly, we don't get along with him too well. So after the holidays, he got going with his legislation. He held one hearing. It had 4 witnesses, and 3 of those witnesses were from Utah, and one of those witnesses was to be a tribal witness. And thankfully, we already had the coalition going, and we're strong and had solidarity in our voice. But you can imagine if you tried to get France, Germany, Spain, Mexico, and Canada to all share a witness spot at a congressional hearing, getting all those folks on the same page and sharing that seat is not going to be easy. So the coalition was pretty upset that that's how the hearing was orchestrated. And through working with the Democrats and using kind of an obscure committee rule, we were able to hold the hearing open and force him to hold a second hearing. And so within a couple of weeks, he was forced to hold a second hearing where each of the 5 tribes were able to come and testify, but not to be outdone, Congressman Bishop invited another 4 witnesses for the state of Utah. And all of this is, I mean, it sounds like an incredible tit for tat. And if you go and watch the hearings, which are all online at the committee's website, you will see some of the amazing tit for tat that Congressman Bishop engages in these committee hearings, which is, supposed to be about serious stuff affecting people's lives. And he is making jokes and trying to kind of catch people in gotcha type questions. It's just terrible. One thing that's actually been good about all of his behavior for us is House leadership has begun to recognize him as not a very trustworthy or a good actor in Congress. And so the legislation coming through his committee, if you can, because we can't really stop it with a Republican majority, he's able to sort of whip his committee Republicans in line, and they will pass through pretty much anything he wants, and all the Democrats can do really is put out press releases. But by making Congressman Bishop out to look like a bad actor, not a trustworthy person, House leadership, who are a little bit more trustworthy maybe, aren't really willing to push his legislation through. It's all relative in Congress. So fortunately, the coalition as well, we were able to all testify together. All 5 tribes spoke out in opposition to his bill. And another interesting part of this, there's a second bill which would actually legislatively approve. Bishop's bill, which was introduced by John Curtis, a new congressman from Utah, would approve what the action Trump took, similar to that. That bill has a few co-sponsors. Introduced a couple of weeks before that was a bill by Congressman Gallego, I think from New Mexico, Arizona. his bill has 20 or 40 co-sponsors, and it was introduced a couple weeks earlier. We've now had two hearings on the Curtis bill, no hearings on the Gallegos bill. So it just kind of shows you how Congressman Bishop is not running a fair game in his hearing. Okay, so Bears Ears and beyond. The Ute Indian Tribe is also fighting to protect tribal resources well beyond Bears Ears. Yes?
There's a bill by Senators Udall and Heinrich that counteract the Curtis bill.
Yeah, and so we are also fighting on the Senate side. And I apologize, in my 20 minutes or whatever, I'm focusing on the House side. But you're exactly right. There's definitely action on the Senate side as well. And actually, kind of going back to Congressman Bishop's reputation, you would expect Hatch and Senator Lee in the Utah delegation to introduce their Senate versions of the Bishop's bill, but they haven't done that because they're trying to keep their reputations intact, sort of. Yeah. So this is stuff going on in Congressman Bishop's committee to attack tribal lands and resources beyond Bears Ears, on federal public lands generally, but also on Indian reservation lands. And I won't go through the whole list, but a lot of these things are in the vein of, you may read about it in the New York Times every now and then, you all might read about it in your local paper here. They are this idea of returning public lands to the states. You should return these lands to us so that we can benefit from their resources and govern them ourselves. We're the local land managers, we can do better than you, all that kind of stuff. The top one would give states the right to permit energy development on federal public lands. There's one in here, this one would transfer right-of-ways across federal public lands to states. There's other ones down here where states could just take like between 2 and 6 million acres of federal public lands under their authority and do for logging, for energy development, whatever. And then all kinds of things about returning lands to the states. And the thing that all those bills have in common is they don't care for the Indian resources that might be found on those lands. State governments don't have the government-to-government relationship with Indian tribes that the federal government has. And so you can't look to state governments, and tribes don't want to look to state governments to protect their resources, to follow proper procedures that keep their resources in mind. I want to highlight this one here, which is Congressman Rob Bishop's Utah Public Lands Initiative. That one is a particular issue. Let's see, I'm going to make sure I covered everything. Okay, so this is kind of a map of the impacts of Rob Bishop's Public Lands Initiative. And the big purple outline is the Ute Indian Tribe's reservation. And I apologize, it's a little hard to see, but the bright colors are all of the things that Congressman Bishop tried to do in that bill. And it's kind of like a hodgepodge throw in the kitchen sink thing of everything that 7 counties in Utah wanted to see done in terms of quote unquote returning public lands to the states and to the counties and local management. The interesting thing about this, you can, except for Bears Ears, which was also originally included in here and further south, you can pretty much see all of the things that were included in Congressman Bishop's bill in this map of the tribe's reservation. And so what that tells me is even though there were 7 counties in eastern Utah involved in putting this bill together, the legislation was built on the back of the Ute Indian Tribe. Pretty much all of the negotiations, except for some of this stuff out here, in one way or another involve the resources of the Ute Indian Tribe. Just like Congressman Bishop's work on the Bears Ears National Monument, he's not included tribes in this Public Lands Initiative, which was a multi-year process. He never came and met with the Tribal Business Committee, never came and consulted with them on a government-to-government basis. And there's as you can see, a lot of impacts that would have been inside the reservation. There were 2 primary drivers of this legislation. The first one was a legislative compromise on the Bears Ears National Monument, which eventually faded away because Bishop wasn't working with the tribes. He wasn't working with them on that part of the legislation and had his own ideas. And then in my mind, the other big driver is these purple blotches and this yellow one here. that what Congressman Bishop was trying to do was take these purple ones, which are scattered state school trust land parcels, and consolidate them inside the Ute Indian Tribe's reservation. And I say the word consolidate, I'm just trying to explain it to you. What it really was the first Indian land grab in 100 years of 100,000 acres, giving the state tribal lands inside the reservation. The reason why the state wants those lands inside the reservation is that area, that kind of square area, is known as the Uinta Basin, which has been a productive oil and gas region since the 1920s or 30s. And so the state was granted these public school trust lands when they became a state, and they're supposed to use those lands to help fund their public schools. Really, it's just like a 1 or 2% kind of bonus to the public school budget. And they can't develop these purple blotches because they're in wilderness areas, and so they're trying to transfer them into where the oil and gas is, which happens to be the Ute Tribe's reservation, which is a Indian land grab. And Robert, who's with the tribe's Ute Pack, will talk a lot more about the tribe's effort to characterize that and make a political movement out of that. So this bill, the Ute Tribe was able to kill. It got out of the committee. Bishop was able to vote it out of his committee. So the tribe was able to kill it in the House Rules Committee, which is where all the House bills go before they go to the floor. Okay. So finally, it's not just federal public lands, but it's also Indian reservation lands are under attack by this Congress and Congressman Bishop in particular. Again, this is the Ute Tribe's reservation. You can see over the couple of 100 years of its existence, there's been all kinds of management regimes which have affected the lands on the ground. The area in brown to the east there, so the reservation known as the Uinta and Ore Reservation is really two reservations that were joined over history. The reservation on the west is the Uinta Reservation. Those are the Uinta Utes who came kind of from the Salt Lake City area. Also the White River live there who came from Colorado. I say live there, these days everybody lives everywhere across the reservation, but historically that's where they live. And then the square area on the east is the Uncompahgre Reservation. Uncompahgre Band of Utes also came from Colorado. The area in brown on the Uncompahgre Reservation is currently managed by the BLM. And those lands should have been restored to the tribe in the 1930s and 40s, but were administratively transferred from Indian Affairs to the BLM, and I'll explain a little bit of how that happened. So I heard allotment mentioned earlier today. How many of you all are familiar with allotment, Indian lands allotment? Pretty many of you, that's awesome. So federal Indian policy has gone through sort of a roller coaster of different waves. Allotment was one of those waves in the late 1800s. It managed to take Indian lands from around 138 million acres down to 48 million acres across the United States, a loss of about 90 million acres of Indian lands. Allotment was the opening up of these reservations to homesteading. The individual tribal members were to get little plots of lands and become farmers, and the areas not allotted to Indians would be open to non-Indian homesteading. This brown area is pretty deserty. There was not a lot of homesteading there, but there was a lot of grazing pressure, not only from the local grazing organizations, non-Indian grazing organizations, but also from grazers coming from Colorado, sheep and cattle grazing. The Uncompahgre Band also had its own strong grazing industry, and these two grazing interests became in conflict a lot. And so in 1933, just prior to the Indian Reorganization Act, which ended allotment, the Secretary of the Interior withdrew the Uncompahgre Reservation as a grazing reserve. So then in 1934, the Indian Reorganization passes Congress, and the United States ends allotment and starts restoring tribal lands to trust status. On the Uinta western side, about 200,000 acres were restored to trust status. On the Uncompahgre western side, no lands were restored to trust status, because by then you had well-established non-Indian grazing presence, also beginnings of discovering oil and gas resources, and so there was no desire within the administration to restore those lands to tribal status. And also there was, at that time, a Utah congressional delegation that thought they could pass legislation disestablishing, or another word for terminating, this reservation, but that legislation never made it through Congress. That legislation didn't make it through Congress, but in 1948, after restoring lands on the Uinta side, the Secretary of the Interior administratively transferred those lands, which were being jointly managed by Indian Affairs and the Grazing Service, which is the entity that precedes BLM, administratively transferred all those brown areas to the BLM. What that is a taking of Indian title. Indian tribes enter into treaties and agreements with the United States for their land areas, and the only entity that can undo that guarantee of Indian title is Congress. In this case, the Secretary of the Interior just approved a memo from BLM transferring the lands from Indian Affairs to BLM. And the Ute Indian Tribe recently filed cases in the Court of Claims as well as the Federal District Court trying to force Interior to restore these lands to trust status and compensate the Ute Indian Tribe for all of the oil and gas resources that have been taken from there. When you go and you get a lease from the Bureau of Land Management to do oil and gas, you get your profits from that. Half of the royalties go to the federal treasury. The other half of the royalties go to the state of Utah. And so you can imagine the millions and billions of dollars that the Ute Indian Tribe has been deprived of since the 1920s and 30s. Okay, I think I got one more. Okay, so for the Ute Indian Tribe, this is a fight that goes back more than 200 years. The Ute Tribe, a lot of you all probably know members of the Ute Indian Tribe. They are not folks to go down without a fight. So I've got for you, you can find all kinds of historical stuff where the tribe is fighting for its lands. And this is a letter from 1919 written to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs by, if I was smart, I would have printed this out for myself, William Walsh and John Duncan, who are both Uinta. And I want to read to you just a couple of parts of it. And I think I'm going to read it from the screen. We Utes are anxious to know, so this is 1919. We Utes are anxious to know what is to be done with our grazing reserve. Every year, these Mormons down at Salt Lake City try to take it away from us. At least every time their legislature meets, they make the attempt. They have no consideration for us. They have taken most of our land already. They try to steal our water and not infrequently succeed in this attempt. And now they will never be satisfied until the Utes no longer have grass to run their stock. It is terribly disconcerting for us, the uncertainty of the thing. And then the last part, both of us who are signing this letter, I'm going to use this little light here. Both of us who are signing this letter have endeavored to the utmost to live as the officials in Washington and as the agent have advised us to live. We both have good homes, large herds of cattle and sheep, good horses, good farms, and are in no sense dependent upon the government for any part of our livelihood, however small it may be. The only thing we ask of the government is protection from these greedy, unscrupulous Mormons, who, by misrepresenting matters, would deprive us of our means of making a livelihood. And we would like an expression from you assuring us that we will be held in possession of our grazing reserve. An expression of this kind would do much among the Indians, for it would relieve us a considerable degree this dread and uncertainty. So imagine living with that kind of uncertainty. The uncertainty of your ability to provide for your family, and to be secure in your home and in your lands and in your community. The Ute Indian Tribe is fighting against this insecurity. That's what I do for them in DC, and we have offices in Colorado and other places around the country where we do that. And we do that on behalf of the tribe. It's an honor to do it on behalf of the tribe to help them protect their lands, resources, and for their people. Thanks very much.
I think normally, as you know, this kind of panel discussion begins with a discussion amongst the panelists themselves. But they will have time to do this later on as well and over the break. So I think what we should do is to invite questions from the audience to the panel about really urgent matters, and I would exhort all of you. I have a rule in my seminars which is not followed by anyone else in the university, and I'm very proud of it, which is one short question at a time. Nobody says, I have 3 questions, or ends their question with an and. So one short question from anybody in the audience, and Sandy will maintain both accuracy and brevity. Questions from the audience. There must be some urgent questions from the audience.
Rollie, I may have heard you incorrectly, but I thought I heard you say that most of the people in Bishop's district are Utes. How did he get elected?
Yeah, sorry if I said that, that's a little off. I couldn't give you the population numbers. What I meant to say is that his district includes most of the reservation. His district also runs, Robert can tell you better than me from our Ute Pack, it runs kind of northwesterly and it takes in some suburbs of Salt Lake City. And so there is a much greater voting population up there. As you may have heard, in Indian country, there is often a lack of access to voting booths, or whatever you call them, polling places, election places. And so the tribal members have to travel long distances to vote. And the Ute Indian Tribe has actually been, sorry, this is probably a longer answer than was intended. The tribe has been talking to the Department of Justice about the lack of polling places on the reservation, you know, hoping that they will do an investigation of the matter, but we don't really expect that to happen under this president.
Other questions?
What can we do to help?
So I'll take that one real quick, just get everybody going here.
That's the last time you
all of the coalition tribes have places where you all can go to donate. The fighting a case in federal district court to protect bears' ears is not cheap. Zuni, Ute Mountain Ute, and Hopi are represented by the Native American Rights Fund. That's a 501c3, you can donate to them. I understand, Catherine, correct me if I'm wrong, Navajo Nation has a GoFundMe page that you can donate to. And if you go to the Ute Indian Tribe's Ute Pack website, utepac.com, you can donate there and direct your donation towards the legal fight. Did I get that right, Robert? Yeah.
Are there other panelists who want to respond to that?
I'd just like to welcome everyone to also follow our Facebook and social media sites and to amplify this issue and to talk amongst yourselves and invite tribal members out to talk about our sacred lands protection issues, because our tribes and tribal members are the experts of our own culture. And rather than relying on a book, I think these are great panels to have amongst each other. And Utah Dene Bakea is also taking donations. So,
I'd like to add to pay attention to what's going on in your public school districts. You know, when we have corporate folks funding curriculum, Exxon, I mean, you name it, Google, Monsanto, these people, the charter school movement is enabling them to have their own high schools. And so we all lose, when we lose public schools, which are really, so I'm really fascinated by the issue of public schools being whatever's going on in the Ute district. There's been some conversation in the aftermath of Parkland and the March for Our Lives of, how did these students learn to do what they're doing? And a little critique or pushback that they've gone to a well-resourced kind of upper middle class public school. And that's true, and certainly not everybody has access to that kind of education right now, which is its own crime. But it's part of the reason that they are a public school, and public schools have a lot of their own issues, but that the curriculum is not yet owned by the NRA, but certainly that's coming. So I would say pay attention and support public schools.
Yeah, I would add to that call to get involved in your kids' education, talk about things at the table, talk about what's going on. I had to explain what water protectors was to my daughter. It is a term that's used in my household. I would say question the narrative and follow the native media. There was recently a crisis at Indian Country Today Media Network, but they are back now. So I know it's kind of hard, but it's really important to seek out these alternative narratives and first-person voices.
Other questions?
I have a microphone if you.
Yes, and I was just wondering, is there now a paper that is similar to the old Akwesasne notes? Years and years ago, when I was teaching American politics, I subscribed to it. And I thought it was great because they did coverage not only in North America, but it did coverage throughout the world. As far as the struggles of indigenous people. So is there a newspaper that in a way replicates it?
I mean, indigenous peoples are extremely active in media, okay, as Amalia explained. And Akwesasne's notes exists still? Yes. And Indian Country Today, right? Yes. And of course, around the world and around the country, maybe I don't know everything, but there are many that exist. And around the world, a lot. And what I find also very interesting is that indigenous people really appreciate, like we said, that radio is appreciated and so on. They also appreciate the written word, meaning, to get the pamphlets in writing, not just electronic. But to have actually a lot of publications, that are coming out about their issues. Yes.
I would also add that many tribes have their own newspapers and websites.
Yeah. I just like Akwesasne because it was so all-encompassing.
Yeah.
So many different countries.
A good place to go on the internet where you find stories from all over Indian country sort of compiled together is indians.com, and it's just basically a list there of every media with links to the actual articles, and they've recently started doing their own kind of investigative reporting, and so you can just click on and it'll take you to newspapers around the country of issues going on in Indian country.
I'd also add Indian Country Today has been having financial struggles, so you can donate to them. And then also, again, demand that national outlets carry stories on what's happening in the local communities. Again, just coming back from Aotearoa, every night on the news, whatever local news, whatever, they all report. Some speak in Maori. They all report what's going on among the Maori in their own communities as part of regular public news. And we never... most people, one of the reasons why people in the U.S. don't even know Indians are alive half the time is because we don't see them. They're invisibilized. And so one thing that Standing Rock achieved is it took forever, I think almost to the end before there was even national news coverage on it. But people actually saw images of Indians, and I can't tell you how many people honestly thought, we thought they were all gone. And that's by design and purposeful. So I would say definitely make those demands.
Carrie, I wonder whether you have something you've been engaged
I'll have my time later to say something.
Thanks for giving me a second question. How do we strike a balance in educating non-Indigenous people about the tribes in the face of the repatriation and protection of sites and the cultures? How do we strike a balance so that people know more?
Well, I think, like I was saying earlier, amplifying some of these news stories. Repatriation is also an issue that's covered not only in the United States, but among First Nations in Canada, among the Ainu in Japan, Australian Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, and the Maori in New Zealand, and also in Africa. And so it's a big issue that hasn't been written about a lot. A few years ago, I think when I began that work in that particular area, people weren't talking about it. And I remember going to conferences and just, I was an undergrad, right? And I started, and later on a law school student, I just kept talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. And people said, this issue will never come up, it'll never be important in the eyes of anyone. But now, the tribes have been pushing among many different Indigenous people coming together on that particular issue, and you can see this happening. This happened at Standing Rock and with Bears Ears now, and Mount Taylor in New Mexico. I think with the rise of social media, this is really helping with independent news sources in our communities to amplify these issues. So, it kind of goes back to go back and find those sources. A lot have been mentioned here, but go back to the communities too. Make sure that the communities and the tribes are talking about these issues and being quoted. Do your own research in a way on the issue, but then help us to get these issues out. So.
Good. Well, thank
There was
you all very
one
much.
more? Can I take one more question?
I hope it's not too long, but I wanted to ask, what do you think the role of traditional ecological knowledge is in the nasty word of development within Indian country, and how would integrate it, and is it respectful, or is it even a thought to use to have cross-cultural Indigenous dialogue to be able to have a deeper understanding of Indigenous ethics on what should we do with development, because there are different ways in which Latin American societies have dealt with development that could be helpful in the U.S.
Maybe I can make a comment about that. You see, I refer to Onondaga chief, faith keeper, Oren Lyons, and who has been saying we are going to our own doom. And what has been happening, in the past, before you were born, if I can say this, when Indigenous peoples were speaking about Mother Earth and these concepts of living well and in harmony with Earth, it was only New Ager types, that were responding to that. But now, I feel, this is the only alternative, actually theory, philosophy of so-called development or of well-being that has resonance. At the United Nations, it's the dominant paradigm. Only the Indigenous voice at the United Nations is heard that is proposing and dreaming or suggesting an alternative. Of course, it has helped that we have had all these bodies of the UN that I alluded to, but also Bolivia, for example, Ecuador, and Bolivia in particular, created pushed this philosophy, created an International Day of Mother Earth, 22nd of April. Every year, a dialogue on harmony with nature. What is this? This is declared water as a human right. These were all Bolivian initiatives. In other words, these are initiatives that are trying to push, to bring visibility to the Indigenous philosophies about how the world can be different. And I think there is resonance and more people. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the new agenda until 2030, you will see it is, of course, it does not shake the dominant paradigm, but you see there are ideas that have been put by indigenous peoples. You see that. You see Mother Earth in the Sustainable Development Goals. You see changing the consumer paradigm. Very interesting. So these are ideas, and so you see harmony with nature in these. So these are interesting times where our mainstream world, so to speak, is more open, because I think we are all seeing, the mainstream is seeing more, that we cannot continue like that going into our doom. These are better times in that sense, I would say.
I think that's an eloquent provisional response. I would love to say, I can see this discussion could go on and on, but we do have a lot of speakers lined up for this afternoon. We must be fair to them. We must be attentive to the call of nature in terms of nourishing ourselves with some real food. So thank you for that excellent question, though. Let's break now.